Okay, so welcome. Before we begin this morning, I would just like to acknowledge that we're here on the ancestral, unceded, traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in Vancouver, Canada. I know some of you are in the land of other nations, so feel free to put those nation names in the chat. And always let us remember our connection to our siblings in these nations and work and pray for the day in which we might be together in right relationship. So welcome to this Justice series. This is the fourth meeting of Justice Exploring its Global Development with Interfaith Educator Harold Rosen here. And today he's going to be taking us through an exploration of Middle Eastern views of justice. So Harold, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah, since it's almost been a month since the last session, I thought I would, do a little bit of review, reorientation. Um, the, the words used to describe the course, I just want to read some of them. This is the course on justice. In turbulent times like our own, it can be helpful to step back and ask, how have humanity's concepts of justice evolved through the ages? Are there signs of progress in our understanding? What is the relationship between justice and religious civilizations with their distinctive legal systems? How have some historical periods enjoyed higher degrees of justice? Can we identify the essentials of justice? So those were some of the things in the course description. And I mentioned some possible motivations early on for taking a course like this. Some people might want to be restoring their faith in humanity and progress because of all the accelerating injustices in the world today. Some people might be wanting to, craft a fair view of today's global challenges. You might have interest in the big picture, the history of major movements, including religions and ideas. You could have perplexity about the nature of justice, given how complicated socioeconomic and political issues are. You might be wondering how to reconcile unity and diversity in a lot of different contexts. These are some different motivations, including wanting to have some sense of how to make the world better. What can I actually do to bring about a more just world? So those are some of the motivations that many of you might have. And I wanted to mention a key assumption I'm bringing to the course, and that's about the origin of justice ideas. I believe that religion is the origin of justice concepts. Not everyone shares that view. In fact, maybe there's two basic schools of thought. One is that religions inspire legal and justice systems, and the other is that human beings on their own, fashion and craft over the years more and more complex systems of law and justice, okay, without divine assistance or origin in any way. Those are the two basic ideas, and I've used the assumption that religion has a lot to do with the rise of concepts of justice and law. And I try to show evidence for that. But people are free to interpret, of course, in their own ways. I mentioned a definition of justice, a provisional definition. Some people, if you ask them to define justice in one word, they might say fairness. They might say equity. They might say healing. I think a lot of indigenous people would say healing is the same as justice. And I gave you a more elaborate definition combining a lot of the ideas people have. You could say justice is a moral spiritual ideal and a concrete social process, providing wide participation, affording basic rights and duties, encouraging cooperation, giving optimal degrees of freedom and equality, appropriate rewards and punishments, while seeking restoration and a flourishing society. So those are some ideas that have been thrown into the justice hopper, so to speak. And so you see, justice is a complex idea, very complex. I mentioned in the very first session that with the reason we have justice is because there are problems, there are injustices, and including things like slavery, oppression, colonialism, patriarchy, autocracy, ideologies of various kinds like fascism and communism. You could also point to prejudice and discrimination, racism, corruption, aggression, war, genocide, ecocide. See, these are the names we've given to the problems, the enormous problems humanity has faced down through the ages. So justice is an attempt to address all of those conditions that we're all too familiar with. Okay, those are some of the ideas we looked at in the very first session. I want to mention the second session, we looked at indigenous concepts and ancient concepts of justice. We looked at Egypt and Mesopotamia very briefly. We talked about the sacred tree idea that goes back to Neolithic times. We looked at Egypt, or rather, and also we looked at Mayan concepts, Navajo concepts, Incan concepts, Iroquois Confederacy concepts. I don't expect you to have remembered all that stuff, but we looked at the circle concept of justice that's in common to some of the older views. In the third session, which was totally impossible, we looked at India and China and all the views that came out of the Hindu, Buddhist, Jain traditions. In China, there's a Confucian and Taoist, as well as a position called legalism by Han Fei, and that Chinese justice has been sort of a dialogue, ongoing dialogue through many, many centuries between a Confucian propriety point of view and a Han Fei legalist point of view. We touched quickly on Shinto and Sikh ideas also last session. That was a month ago in December. Okay, all that brings us to today, looking at Middle Eastern concepts of justice. We're basically going to look at Persian Zoroastrian ideas and Islamic ideas of justice. Those are the two big pieces. I wanted to describe Persian and Zoroastrian ideas for maybe 15 minutes and then stop and see if you have comments or questions or perplexities or whatever about the Persian approach to justice, the ancient Persian ideas. Then I want to look at Islam for a while and stop and see what your comments and questions about that are. It makes sense to call this the Middle East. See, if we're looking at ancient Persia and Arabia, and two great religious systems that emerged there that had a very well developed system of justice that undergirded the rise of very complex societies and even civilizations, and to some extent were role models for other parts of the world. So I gave you 10 pages on all this, and the first page had an outline of, or a timeline touching on Zoroaster about 1000 BCE, 3000 years ago, although that's controversial when his date was, and his teaching of righteousness, which meant good thoughts, good words, good deeds, and it was a very elaborate system, and we'll look a little bit at that. Then there were two great Persian kings that came in the wake of Zoroaster's teaching, Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great. We'll look at them, and they're even mentioned in the Bible, Cyrus and Darius. I'd like to show you a quote or two about them in the Christian Bible. We'll look at Muhammad's Quranic revelation coming through the Quran and within 200 years developing a very elaborate legal system. I don't think this is understood in the West very well. When we hear the word Sharia, for example, we assume that that's something bad. When we hear the word jihad, we think that that's something very bad. I just want to show you some of the original meanings of these terms, and you'll be pleasantly surprised, I believe. We'll look at fiqh, F-I-Q-H in English, which means something like jurisprudence or philosophy of law or a wise and just approach to law. We'll look at some figures in Islamic history that were quite elaborate in setting up a legal system, like Suleiman the Magnificent from the Ottoman Turks, and Akbar, who was a great Muslim ruler in India in the 1500s. So this will give us a sense of how Islam developed and generated a very complex and in some cases very effective justice system. Okay, I'm looking at the bottom of page 1 of the handout for today. I want to comment on Zoroaster. You've heard of the Magi, those wise kings who visited Jesus. The Magi, according to Zoroastrian tradition, were sent by Zoroaster. He told them in about 1,000 years there's going to be another king of kings, and you're going to bring him gifts. And he told them where they could direct their steps. But anyway, Zoroaster had an incredibly rich ethical monotheism. The theme was good thoughts, good words, good deeds, or righteousness. And Zoroaster told us that, in effect, he was channeling the teachings of Asha, a Holy Spirit that focused specifically on justice and moral order. The Gathas were the writings that we still have of Zoroaster that are in the form of psalms, beautiful moral spiritual statements that contain the original teachings of Zoroastrianism. God was called Ahura Mazda, meaning the wise Lord in the Zoroastrian tradition. And we're going to look in some detail at Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great, who were in the wake. They came about 500 years after Zoroaster's revelation. So by that time, it had a chance to develop into a legal and justice system. I'm looking at page 2, which lists some of the highlights of Persian civilization. I don't want to go into those, but I'm giving you that as background so that you can overcome some of the normal Eurocentrism. When I was in school, I learned that the Persians were the bad guys picking on the Greeks. And that's pretty much what I learned about the Persians, right? I also had vaguely heard, that Aeschylus had written a play called The Persians, which surprised the Greeks because he was portraying Persians as reasonable people who had problems and challenges and opportunities like anyone else. Anyway, so part of what I'm hoping to do is we're redressing Eurocentrism by saying, again, we've done this before, looked at other parts of the world besides Europe that have generated very important foundational ideas. There were 3 big empires in, what we call Persian civilization: the Achaemenian, I've given dates, the Parthian, the Sasanian. Something to know is the Persian Empire was the eastern border of the Roman Empire. In other words, the 2 great superpowers of the day through much of ancient history were Rome on one side and Persia on the other. And Persia has a lot going for it, just like the Greco-Roman civilization had a lot going for it. I mentioned the Gathas as the sayings or writings of Zoroaster we still have. The Avesta, the Zend Avesta, is the name of the collective Zoroastrian scriptures. And I mentioned some of the parts of that. In general, about 1/3 of the Zoroastrian scriptures are about law, 1/3 about moral and spiritual guidance, and 1/3 might be called traditional knowledge. Some of that would be scientific and historical and geographic knowledge. Okay, and then 2/3 of the way down on page 2, I have something extremely important there, a summary. I wrote, from the Zoroastrian point of view, kings were responsible to the Grand Senate. Kings were responsible to the Grand Senate and the popular assembly for good governance. The king could be deposed by them, that is, by the Senate and the popular assembly, if he failed his supreme function. There was a hierarchy of judges and a hierarchy of magi or priests and a hierarchy of administrators and a well-organized police system. So that's a very quick summary of Persian civilization at its best. It's there 2/3 of the way down on page 2. A few other things. You could say the Persian Empire combined the centralization of power with decentralization of administration. There were provinces, about 20 to 24 of them, that each had their own governor. On page 3, I mentioned things like that the Persian Empire became the model of just governance for the ancient world, the model. So it was a model for people in India. It was a model to some extent for China. It was a model for the Greco-Roman civilization because it was more well developed earlier than they. This is something not very well understood. Cyrus the Great said everyone in the empire was free to worship any god they pleased. And his law code he called the Ordinance of Good Relations. What an amazing idea. The Ordinance of Good Relations. We're going to set up something that today, when we study it, it sounds like human rights, a charter of human rights, and a multiculturalism policy. Many different cultures each have something to bring to the table, and that's to be respected. Okay, so Cyrus the Great was truly great. At least this is my opinion. A role model for many other later emperors. He was called the father of his people, the shepherd of many flocks. The Bible calls him a Messiah, an anointed king. And I want to show you some of the language of that. But before I get to that, there's a little bit more at the bottom of page 3. Cyrus was incredibly diplomatic. He said things like, and I quote it here, to Ahura Mazda. This was an injunction he frequently used. To Ahura Mazda, or the wise Lord, the invisible creator, the ever present, and whatever other gods there may be. Can you see how diplomatic that is? Right? He's talking to people from 24 different provinces, and he's saying he's providing, a blessing and saying, addressing it to Ahura Mazda or whatever other gods there may be. Right? Very, very inclusive language. Okay. Philosophically, Cyrus liked unity and diversity questions. And he was interested in, like, how can there be unity behind all the diversity, both intellectually speaking and politically speaking and religiously speaking? That fascinated him, the one and the many. Okay, he set up a royal road with a courier or mailing system. I'm on page 4. And he organized a huge piece of the world. It included what we would call Mesopotamia, Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, were added to the Achaemenid Empire, which was Old Persia, which included part of what we would today call Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq. So that's very big. And then his successor, Darius, made it even bigger, adding what we would call Turkey or Asia Minor and Egypt. I don't know if you can imagine how much real estate this is. It also included some of what we would today call Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. It was the biggest empire the world had ever seen under Cyrus and Darius. 1/3 of the way down on page 4, there's a quote from the book of Isaiah, chapter 44. Do some of you have, I hope all of you have this handout I've asked people to print it. I'm wondering if I can call on, Elaine, you've got it. Would you be willing to read what it says there? I have it in italics. Thus says the Lord. This is from the book of Isaiah in the Hebrew scriptures. Can you read that?
Thus says the Lord, Cyrus is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose. Jerusalem shall be built, the temple foundation shall be laid. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will give the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, calling you by name. I have aroused Cyrus in righteousness, and I will make straight all his ways. He shall build my city and set my exiles free. The wealth of Egypt and the merchandise of Ethiopia and the Sabaeans, men of stature, shall come over to you and be yours. Wow.
These are the words of God as recorded in Isaiah, talking about Cyrus or Cyrus. I think Elaine's accent is better. She's combining. I'm sort of giving it the Western, version, calling him Cyrus, but Cyrus, I think is closer to the original Zoroastrian. But this is an amazing thing. So Cyrus is considered an anointed one, a savior, a king being used for divine purposes to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem and help the Jews and let them out from their exile. They were captured. It was called the Babylonian exile or captivity. Cyrus freed them because he discovered they had one God, as he had one God, and it must be the same God. They were religious brothers, and so he freed them. That's a rather nice thing for a king to do for an oppressed people, and that's really lauded in the Hebrew scriptures. Later on in the book of Ezra, it says this, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia." This is also the middle of page 4, my handout. "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem and rebuild the house of the Lord." So this is in the book of Ezra, Cyrus quoted again. Sometimes Darius is quoted too in the Hebrew scriptures. So those two kings are extremely important in ancient history and in support for Israel as a people. All right, I put 2/3 of the way down page 4, a summary of the legacy of Cyrus. And this is how I would put it. He was considered the guiding genius in the largest empire the world had seen, an ideal ruler, a wise statesman, and a morally exemplary model for Greek, Roman, Hindu, and Buddhist emperors, which came later. Cyrus might also be called humanity's first interfaith bridge builder and seeker of world unity. Okay. All right. Then, 8 years after Cyrus came Darius. And it's quite amazing when you have two great kings or rulers back to back or close to back, something amazing happens. Another example of that is more familiar to you, David and Solomon, right? And also remember we talked about the Gupta Empire back in India. That was a month ago. There were four great rulers back to back. Oh my goodness, each one with about 30 years. And how much good can you do if you have sound justice principles and you're a patron of learning, which all of these great rulers were? They fostered learning. They were interested in diverse ideas and developing what you might call a meritocracy, help people express their talents for the good of the social order. Okay, so Darius the Great, I gave his dates there, 522 BCE to 486. That's a long time. He improved on all the things that Darius had done, like that royal road with the courier system. He compiled all of the Zoroastrian scriptures, not just what Zoroaster himself wrote directly, but with some inspired literature that came in the wake. All of that was called the Zend-Avesta. Darius built a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea. He made Persepolis an incredible city that showed the diversity of the provinces and how the cultures were respected, religions were respected. So this guy, Darius, is the one who started to get into controversy with the Greeks. He wanted to expand the Persian Empire over into the Caspian Sea area and what we call Asia Minor, which touches on close to the Greek islands. So what I learned as the bad guys of Greeks, of the the bad guys in Persia picking on Greeks, is way more complicated than that. A very just empire was trying to expand and include and in a way protect the area that the Greeks identified. So this forced Greek identity to get organized. This is our land, all these islands, the people who are Greek speaking. We don't want to have an autocracy, which is how they perceived the benevolent rule of Persia to be, right? So I'm giving you another perspective on the Greek-Persian conflicts that occurred. Anyway, in the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks defeated the Persians, even though they were greatly outnumbered. So militarily, that was a great achievement. Also, it clarified that they wanted to have a different kind of rule, a much more democratic kind of rule. And so Western history takes off from there. But I'm giving you a larger perspective. Okay. The legacy of Darius was that he was an incredible administrator, a just administrator, had a very fair legal system. He believed in art, so he set up a lot of cosmopolitan art displays, and he had a lot of respect for cultural diversity, and he was more directly Zoroastrian in his beliefs. So he codified Zoroastrian scriptures. Okay, that's some of what we would say. From our point of view, though, looking at justice, I want to tell you what Darius did. He sent what he called royal inspectors randomly at different times to all of the provinces. So these were people just watching to see what was going on. If there was any sign of corruption, it would be reported and they would quickly try to fix it. I'm very impressed with what I understand about this ancient Persian imperial rule because of its hierarchical nature, because they had something that we would call the rule of law, whereby, rulers had to be just. There were ways of getting rid of them through something like a Senate and something like a People's Assembly. Another misbelief we have is that the whole idea of a bicameral legislature came to the world through Greece and Rome. And it turns out this is not the case. There were models of a bicameral legislature in ancient Persia, where you had this thing like a Senate and another thing like the People's Assembly. Okay, and of course, we don't know as much about this because Alexander the Great, who was called Alexander the Accursed by the Persians, burned a lot of the books, right? So we don't have as much detail about ancient Persia as we would like, which would also cast light on India and China if we had those books, because they were collecting knowledge from all over the world. However, after Alexander burned all those books, they were reconstructed a lot to a pretty thorough degree by the Magi, who were priests and scholars. Different kind of priests, extremely well-educated priests that could be called scholars or even scientists in some respects. Okay, that's a quick introduction to Zoroastrian Persian civilization and its elaborate legal and justice system. And I may have exaggerated a little bit on the side of how great it was, but I'm trying to sort of overcome a degree of Eurocentrism, which looked at Persia as an evil empire. In its foundation, it was not an evil empire. It was a great empire that had high standards. Like every other part of humanity, it fell short, of those high standards. But it really gave the world tremendous gifts in terms of a view of a just legal system. Okay, comments, questions, perplexities about any of this, or additions. You may know stuff that I don't know about this part of the world. You know, to think of what I told you, so in the Bible, Darius and Cyrus are referred to and quoted even, and God is talking about them. So that alone should make Westerners very alert to the importance of the ancient Persian world. Try to understand it, where it fits in the evolution of our highest ideals. Yeah, Elaine, please. Mhm.
Well, I'm just thinking back. I feel that my education system impoverished me, at least through high school. I mean, once you get to university, you're free to choose, and you obviously did, Harold. You chose to investigate the things that were calling you. But when it comes to basic literacy, cultural literacy, everybody who graduates from grade 12, whatever the equivalent is, continent to continent, should have some sense of the world. And where I came from, no sense of the world. My only hope is that in this age, 3 generations later, somebody like Khan Academy has a way of making basic cultural literacy as well as scientific literacy available cheaply to everyone. So hopefully this horrible darkness that we all grew up in will pass.
Well, you know, you mentioned the Khan Academy. I want to say something about that later when we get to Islam, the second half of this class, because Ismailis, led by the Aga Khan, had a very glorious period in ancient Egypt that and generated what we call the what is the name of that big university? Al-Azhar University in Cairo. And many Ismaili Muslims were important in Canada, have been important in Canada, especially through the Liberal Party. I see your hand up, Baxter. Please, sorry, Baxter.
Oh, no, no problem. Harold, I know the Zoroastrians kind of were exemplary astronomers and astrologers, but did they not, and this is my question, did they not, were they the founders of the number zero? Was it Zoroastrian that added zero to the science of
You know,
mathematics?
Aryabhata in India really made a big deal of the zero. And the Muslims discovered his zero when Muslims were, gathering the knowledge of the world, that included Indian knowledge. And Aryabhata, who was late in the Gupta Empire, was an incredible mathematician. So that set up a basis for negative and positive integers, higher math, algebra. He even dealt with trigonometry. Now, I'm not going to say he's the first guy who found the zero. See, I don't think we know. I think, some people say Pythagoras discovered the zero, and he was about 1000 BCE. So I don't know how we can know that, the complete history of math, but certainly the Persians were interested in gathering knowledge. That's what the Magi did, right? They gather knowledge, integrate it with revelation, with teachings from Ahura Mazda that came to us through Zoroaster. That's the kind of thing they were told. We don't know all the sources but I wouldn't be surprised if they had a zero or something related to it, because they would have respected a figure like Pythagoras or great mystics and mathematicians. Okay, are there other hands up? Yeah, Donna, please, Donna. Mhm.
I don't know how exactly, this is what's in my mind, and I'm wondering if you can address it. You mentioned how the influence of Cyrus and Darius to the civilizations of China and India.
Yes.
And I wondered how much of that actually, because recalling our session when we talked about Asia, I don't remember that you referenced any influence
Oh,
from
okay.
Zoroaster. And
Let
so
me
I'm just wondering, in a slightly 21st century time, how much of that persists through history, those early teachings that stayed with other civilizations. And the reason I'm asking that is because the concepts of justice evolved in kind of isolation geographically in these different areas. And I'm beginning to wonder, we live in a time of not isolation, and therefore these concepts of justice, how much of that actually carries through to where we are today? What do we have in common, and what is just a period of time of history? And then, oh, too bad, they burned all the books, or whatever all of that means. Yeah.
Donna, that's an incredibly important question you're asking. Here's a little bit of evidence that's an example of what I was saying, that that Cyrus and Darius were models. Here's a very concrete example. So 250 years after them, which is about 250 BCE, there was a king in India called Ashoka.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ashoka completely organized, incorporated all of India. And he did so under a legal system a lot like the imperial Persian one. He even did things a lot like Darius. For example, Darius would chisel into stone various principles in put them in central. There were four capitals, unbelievable. The empire was so big there were four capitals in ancient Persia. So those capitals would include stone pillars of basic principles to remind people. Well, Ashoka did a similar thing. He did it with Buddhist principles, right? That's a very concrete example of how there's modeling. China was very interested in learning from other people. And China specifically went out of its way to learn about Buddhism and Ashoka. What are the legal and justice implications of a new revelation or a new dharma, to use the Eastern term? So you see what I mean? Great civilizations learn from each other. They send dignitaries to study. The guy from China spent 15 years, studying Buddhism, learning the language and translating the texts. So also the trade, the Silk Road system, it wasn't just one road, many roads. So when you're exchanging commodities, you're also exchanging ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't make any sense to say these civilizations were isolated. They traded with each other over long periods of time. Of course, not as fast as today, but for example, we find things, objects in, say, Jerusalem that came from far away, maybe in India. So there was some kind of trade, and vice versa. We find objects created thousands of miles away. We dig them up. This is part of the whole field of archaeology. So the influence was there. It's just it took a little longer to spread, right? Yeah. So when you say that Darius and Cyrus were models of imperial rule, that had a way of being conveyed, right? You had a way through traveling priests usually, and through just business talk. When you're trading with a nation, you share, some of the ruling ideas in that nation with other people. Okay, that's as much as I understand of this. It's much quicker today, of course, with the internet.
Yeah.
It's instantaneous in many ways. And through TV, we see what's going on a lot of places all at once. All that was a lot slower. What impresses me about Cyrus and Darius was this royal inspection thing. He actually wanted people to go see what's going on. You know who did that too? Ashoka did the same thing. Tell me if all the needs are being met in all the villages in India. I would like to know. How are they treating animals? Is there a place for travelers to stay? Caravanserai, or motels, we call them today. Okay, that's the evidence, I think, or pointing to the evidence of why we say it was influential. Now, you also have the opposite going on. You can go out of your way to not mention things. To me, it looks like Greece and Rome went out of their way not to mention anything they might have learned from Persia, right? Because if Persia is the evil empire, we don't want to have anything to do with them. We're different. It doesn't look that way. That's an unfair assessment. It looks like there was we say the patricians and the plebeians, that's the origin of a bicameral legislature in the West. However, 400 or 500 years before that, there was something similar in Persia. I think there was something similar in India too, but the records are harder to access, right? India seems to have had this same idea that a king is responsible to bring about just rule and meet the needs of the people. Remember, the Chinese version of that was the mandate of heaven. The sage kings were considered sage because they followed the mandate of heaven, which was the expectation from the supreme leader. That's not the word reader, the creator. The Lord of creation, or Shangdi, expected rulers to meet the needs of the people, to overcome floods, to distribute wealth, to make sure canals are bringing fresh water to people. So, yeah, it looks to me like the highest minded justice principles come from some sort of divine origin as understood as religion by different peoples. Okay, your question is incredible. Anyway, that's what I think some of the evidence is for saying that, say, Cyrus and Darius were models. How did that model get across? Okay, other comments, questions about all these things? Yeah, Bill, you're almost about to say something.
Well, I think again, what you're relating, it's sort of overwhelming, to realize how it's not just culturally centric that our views come from. People that would consider themselves culturally literate probably rely on sources that only view maybe the last 20 to 40 years as being the most relevant, much less these much vaster time periods that we're talking about, and understanding how really civilization has developed over a longer time period than we can imagine. And what we even consider as a period of civilization, say back to 6,000 years ago, that's only the last 200 generations of humans, whereas our whole history extends at least to 10,000 and maybe many tens of thousands of generations. So I think we can, it leads to a greater appreciation of the acceleration that's was already rampant beginning, 6,000 years ago compared to our whole history as a creature.
Yeah. Amen to everything you're saying, Bill. Thank you so much. Okay, Roz, your hand is up, and then Donna might want to say something else. Okay, Roz, yeah.
I have a simple question. The symbol that we often see for Zoroaster is like a flame or a fire. And I just wondered what that actually symbolizes.
Zoroastrianism has two main symbols. One of them is right there. That's Zoroaster with his wings of the spirit and being guided, through the Holy Spirit by Ahura Mazda. But the one you're talking about is like a flaming chalice, a giant flaming chalice like this. So in the fire temple, that's what they called ancient Zoroastrian temples, fire temples. There's a big chalice that's supposed to be an eternal light kept burning by the priests, symbolizing, light and warmth from above. Now, it's interesting what happened because Zoroastrians became called fire worshipers. They're worshiping the fire. The fire was a symbol pointing to the source of all light and warmth and knowledge and truth and goodness, the wise Lord. A symbol pointing. But, human beings do get too literalistic. So there might have been some Zoroastrians who, in a sense, thought of that the fire is God. It's not just pointing me to Ahura Mazda. Anyway, this is my understanding that, there's a fire temple in Burnaby because enough Persians, Zoroastrians rather, I should say Zoroastrians, not because Zoroastrians were kicked out of Persia. There's still about 80,000 there, but a lot went to India, Mumbai in particular, or Bombay. So today's Zoroastrians, maybe 300,000 of them total. Some of them moved to, the British Commonwealth countries, like Canada and Australia and England, when India, split, between Pakistan and India. When that division occurred, some Zoroastrians who were in Bombay went to other countries. That's how they could end up in Burnaby. Now, who asked this?
I did.
Oh, yeah. So the fire temple, and a real life version of that is in Burnaby on Canada Way. That became a symbol of the whole faith, right? Just like the cross for Christians and the Star of David for Jews.
Thank you.
One of two symbols. I see this other one too, with Zoroaster, having the wings of the Spirit supporting him. Okay, other questions, comments, observations? I hope a lot of that was new and interesting to you, and builds bridges between things you already knew a little bit. So yeah, Persian history is a big missing piece. Oh, Bill, I got to go back to something you were saying. Temporocentrism, the idea that anything more than 30 years old is out of date. I don't think that's true. Sometimes newer is better, and sometimes it's worse and more superficial. Should we throw away all the classics? Do we want to throw away scriptures? They're very old, right? Yeah, so
Right.
Temporocentrism and Eurocentrism, they don't mean that there's nothing good in Europe or nothing good that's recent, but they tend to be the belief that anything that isn't European or new is worthless. It has been superseded, Yeah, no, I think a lot of books that are popular might not be as good, say, as Plato's Republic, or something that goes back a long ways. Yeah, we might get more out of reading the Gathas of Zoroaster, than some modern poetry, for example. Okay, friends, let me go on to the last 5 pages. So 4.5, almost 5 pages were on Persia. Now we turn to Muhammad, the Quran, and the Hadith, which starts on the bottom of page 5. And there's some things I want you to read too. I'm looking for readers. Elaine read a little bit. I'd like some other readers to read some paragraphs that will put Islam on your map in a completely different way, just like we did with Persia. But let me build up to that. At the bottom of page 5, I put sometimes you fall in love with your own sentences. I put here near the bottom of page 5, the central theme of Muhammad's message is that human beings should submit voluntarily to God. Such submission brings inner peace and enables people to establish a just social order in which the gifts bestowed by God to humanity develop into a unified spiritual nation. And in those days, this nation idea was big. It meant a unified spiritual empire or civilization. Okay, so that's my attempt to summarize what Islam is, basically. submission to the author of creation who's giving you the bounty of new revelation, which if followed would not only bring you inner peace, but would transform society into a just, wide-ranging social order. That's what Islam is supposed to be. I'm not saying it has always been operated in that way, right? Christianity is a very good idea. Judaism is a very good idea. Islam is a very good idea too. And Zoroastrianism is a very good idea. Human beings fall short of these high standards. Okay, on page 6, I give you a description of the Quran. And I don't want to go into those details, but I want to say in general, for what we're looking at, justice, the Quran, I'm looking at 1/3 of the way down on page 6. The Quran supports family life, generosity, tolerance, equality, justice, consultative governance, defense of Islam, alleviating suffering, helping the afflicted, extending kindness and charity, women's dignified role in education, punishing of wrongdoing, as well as as well as racial and cultural respect. All of that is in the Quran. Am I saying Muslims have followed it perfectly over the last 1400 years? No, of course not. But all of that is the teaching of the Quran. I put 10 major themes of the Quran, including the nature of the Quran and its authority, the nature of God, names and attributes, messengers of God, faith and practice, human nature, roles and rights of women. That's a major theme, one of the top 10 themes in the Quran, the roles and rights of women. So there is such a thing as an Islamic feminist. I used to think that that was a contradiction in terms. There couldn't be anything like Islamic feminism. Islamic feminism means a woman who really knows the Quran well as the Hadith, which is the traditions that were, in other words, Muhammad's answers to questions about the Quran. It's a large body called the Hadith, which is needed to build Islamic law. So there are women who get educated, know the Arabic, they know the Quran, they know the Hadith, and they know the Sharia, the 4 systems of Islamic law, as dignifying women and protecting them. They also know about the violations of all that. That's what an Islamic feminist can do. Okay, whereas I once thought, I was so prejudiced, there can't be such a thing as Islamic feminism. The whole thing is anti-women, I thought. I didn't have any knowledge about what the Quran really does or says. Okay, the Hadith, I mentioned that 1/3 of the way down on page 6. Several large volumes of sayings or traditions of the Prophet, or his immediate family too. They cast much light on interpreting the Quran and have been crucial in the development of Islamic law. You will find Muslims who say that all we have is the Quran, nothing else matters. And I don't think that's correct. The Hadith matters because that was Muhammad and his immediate family's attempt to explain the meaning of the Quran and the social and legal implications. So we need the Hadith to understand the development of Islamic law and also to understand how the Quran was interpreted. You need the Hadith. Okay, I list some highlights of Islamic civilization. I give you the major periods of Islamic history, including the founding, the Umayyad Empire centered in Damascus. On page 7, I mentioned the Abbasid Empire was spectacular. That was 500 years of Islamic civilization centered in Baghdad, and that at about the same time as 500 years or so of Islamic Spain centered in Cordoba and Alhambra and a few other cities. So in other words, for 500 years, between about 750 and 1250, you have 2 very well-developed Islamic civilizations, or Islamdom East and Islamdom West. It's as parallel to what happened in Christianity. You had an Eastern Christianity and a Western Christianity with 2 different cities that were central to those. The Ottoman Empire came along. That's almost 600 years, centered in Istanbul. The Mughal Empire in India, centered in Delhi. But it only had one really good ruler. That's my opinion. Akbar the Great. We'll mention him. Islamic Persian Empire, centered in Isfahan, about 220 years there. And then the period I call Islamic decline and independent states, from about 1918 to the present. The Islamic world has been divided up into separate nations that sometimes have nothing to do with each other or are mutually hostile. That's a far cry from those two major, three, let's say, major Islamic empires. The one in Spain, the one centered in Baghdad called the Abbasid, and the one called the Ottoman, which had enormous impact on the development of European history, centered in Istanbul. Bottom of page 7, I define this term jihad. You know, jihad means struggle. That's what it means in Arabic. And the implication is the struggle to bring about good in the world. That's the kind of struggle being referred to, moral, spiritual struggle. So Muhammad has sayings, these are hadith about this. He said there's a jihad of the heart. Let's call it devotion or worship. There's a jihad of the hands. Let's call that useful craft making or industry. A jihad of the head, let's call that scholarship or learning, useful forms of knowledge. And then the jihad of the sword, which he says is the lesser jihad. The other three are the greater, and the lesser is the jihad of the sword, which means defending with force a divine society. Defending with, so this is what has been called in the West the just war theory. Is it ever justified to use force? Yeah, I saw a hand there. Elaine, please.
I've never seen this before, Harold. I've never seen these breakdown of the variations of jihad. And it strikes me that it's very much like the 4 forms of yoga that make up Raj Yoga.
It's
Because,
universal, is it not? I agree with you. Very
yeah,
interesting.
jihad of the heart is Bhakti Yoga, and jihad of the head is Jnana Yoga, wisdom
Yes.
yoga, and it's possible that the industry, the crafts, the right
Karma.
action, karma yoga, and even the warrior part of jihad
Yes.
of the sword could be based on healthy athleticism like hatha yoga.
Interesting. Very interesting. I love parallels like that. Fantastic. You know, okay, you say you hadn't heard of this other kinds of jihad. You heard about the fourth kind you heard about because it's in the news, right? And it tends to mean terrorism. In most people's minds, the word jihad means terrorism. And I'm just trying to show you how far that is from the original meaning. And we wouldn't know this if there were no hadith. In other words, people asked Muhammad questions about jihad and it got unpacked, right, into these other areas. That's why another reason why I know we need the hadith to understand the Quran and to understand the complexity of Islamic civilization. I'm going on quickly. On page 8, I have this incredible summary of all these important legal terms. And we can't look at all of them, but I want to show you how important they are. Look under Sharia there. The word Sharia means the common path or the way, the way to the water, which then got broadened into meaning the path of just living. Sharia, so Sharia means law, Islamic law, but there are 4 schools and lots of variations within those 4 schools, and we could call them liberal, moderate, conservative, and ultra-conservative. And each of those schools is popular in different parts of the Islamic world. I put the countries, for example, the most liberal forms of Islam seem to be in some parts of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, India, and Indonesia. And some of the most conservative or ultra-conservative, which began in Baghdad, then moved to, let's say, Arabia and the Persian states. have some of the most conservative. But as I understand it, people who live there say, yes, we have a different form of Islamic law. Follow the law where you go. If you're in one place, a certain Sharia system is in place. You just follow it. It's understood that that's okay to have variation because it's built on local customs and a lot of reasoning about what's proper in this part of the world. So the terms are utterly, to me, intriguing there. Fiqh means what we would call jurisprudence, treating law with justice and wisdom, thinking about law and trying to apply it most fairly. Ilm means knowledge, especially of the law. It also means civilized behavior. Ulama are those learned in the law. Judges, jurisprudence, having authority to shape public life. Usul al-Fiqh means sources of law, and the two basic sources are the Quran on one hand and the Hadith on the other, two big sources. And Furu al-Fiqh means branches or applications of law, like marriage law, business law, etc. So the same complexity that you find in Western legal traditions, like through the British or the French, you find equally complex or more complex legal systems in Islam at its best. Now, look at this term, ijtihad. It's halfway down on page 8. Ijtihad. It means independent legal judgment by those who consult traditions and new fields of knowledge, taking into account studies of changing conditions. It means entitlement to challenge and develop the laws. Ijtihad. So, wow, if you do ijtihad, you have to be special. Now, but this can be abused. So it means you're allowed to interpret law and develop it in a new way because of how sophisticated your background is. But what if you're corrupt? You could use your power to bump the law to favor your family, for example, or to keep you in power when you're starting to lose your marbles. So ijtihad is on one hand a great concept, and it also could be abused easily. And of course it has. Look at these other concepts. Ijma means the consensus of the wisest teachers. Very important consensus of the wise. Qiyas means legal reasoning by analogy based on a parallel situation mentioned in the Quran or in the Hadith. Taqlid means following established teachings or precedent, what's called precedent in the Western system. On and on and on. I need another reader. Rachel, are you still here? No, you're not here. Heidi, do you have a copy of this? No.
I can't read right now. I'm sorry.
Can't read. Okay. Well, Donna, you might be able to read. There's a part called Women's Rights and Responsibilities.
Yes,
I've fallen in love with this summary. And if you could read it, it's 2/3 of the way down on page 8.
I have it, yes.
You have it. Okay, please.
The Quran teaches that men and women were created of like nature, as mates and companions for one another, as a divine favor, having mutual rights and responsibilities, and should live together on the basis of kindness and equity. Men are forbidden to inherit women against their will, and must not treat them with harshness, must give them their dowries at least as prescribed, and allot to them all that they earn. In divorce, mutual agreements should be sought on an equitable basis, and women cannot be turned out of their homes. The spiritual equality of men and women is declared for men and women who are patient and constant, who humble themselves, who guard their chastity, who engage in God's praise. For them, God has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. They must protect one another, and both can enter paradise.
So that's a summary of a lot of stuff, which if you go into the details, is a lot of women's rights. For example, women get the home in a divorce. Who
Well,
gets the house? They can't be turned out of their house. That has been interpreted as they get the house because they're the main child rearers. They need the house to keep on going. So on and on and on. The Islamic feminists understand everything in the Quran, and this paragraph, they could unpack the details for us. So there's a lot of women's rights in the Quran and the Hadith. However, those various legal systems sometimes have deviated profoundly from it. Like today in Afghanistan, it looks like women have almost no rights that are well developed in Islamic tradition. You have to protect yourself from other points of view so well to have what you have in Afghanistan. That's my observation. It's a complete violation of women's rights in Islamic Sharia. Can you keep going, Donna? Can you read what it says there about slaves?
Yep.
Next, yeah.
Muhammad gradually freed his own slaves as they took on more responsibility and became more educated. He encouraged a system of gradual manumission or emancipation of slavery, making such emancipation a cardinal virtue. Slaves were given the right to earn and purchase their own freedom, and some rose to positions of considerable influence.
So this is a summary of the Islamic teaching about slavery, which it looks incredibly enlightened, way ahead of Western Enlightenment thinking, I believe. Donna, you have a comment. Yeah.
Well, I have a problem with both of the things that I just read.
Right. Okay.
And it has to do with, I mean, how good that they put something down, but it's from a position of, well, the two things that jump out of me is the previous paragraph where I said both can enter paradise. Well, that's because this thing is generated from a place of, well, only one of us can get into paradise, not both of us. So it's male generated. And the same thing with this, some slaves were given the right, it's assuming that they don't have it and now they were given it.
Right.
So I have a real problem with all of
but
it.
Remember the context. In the same with Jesus. Jesus mentioned certain things because of what the Pharisees had done. Muhammad mentioned certain things because of what kind of abuses there were going on. For example, women were considered completely inferior beings. Girls were, infant girls were buried in the sand. Because what good are girls? We want boys to protect us. Anyway, so yes, you're right. Muhammad was addressing the context, talking to men in public and saying, I know what you think, and I'm telling you something different. God wants you to change your ways on this. Of course, Islamic civilization has veered far from some of this lofty teaching. We're studying justice. We're studying like the highest versions of it, right?
But
Yeah.
does justice basically, we're talking about in the larger sense of it, all to do with power? What is justice? Justice is power over somebody else or not, or equalizing.
I think
power.
the relationship between justice and power is very, very complex. I don't think it's right to say it's about power. It's also to say it's about rights. It's about equality. This really expands. See, especially what you mean by power. You probably mean domination when you say power.
Yes.
What
Yes.
if power also meant the capacity to do good, the capacity to serve? That could be power as well. So power is a word that has to be completely restudied and rethought about, along with the word justice. Right? There's lots of abuses of power. There's lots of abuses of justice. How about love? There's abuses of love too. Human beings can ruin any good thing. So yeah, I think a word like power and a word like justice needs to be looked at carefully, and the range needs to be sort of identified, and you pick out better and worse forms of justice and power. Okay, that's just my little soapbox point of view. I think it's similar to what you're saying, though. I agree with you. It looks good on paper, but how is it practiced? Yeah, yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, can you go one more? What about the
Okay.
just war theory?
Okay.
Summarize what Muhammad said about just use of force.
Okay. Muhammad forbade violence against I'll start again. Muhammad forbade violence against civilians, non-combatants, women, children, priests, rabbis. Forbade initiating aggression, allowed proportionate defense against attack, forbade use of fire in warfare. Jihad, justified defense, was only declarable by heads of state. Neither civic buildings nor agricultural lands may be destroyed. Well, we certainly don't see that today.
No, they knocked down 2 tall buildings in New York, right? That was considered jihad, and that was done by people that were not heads of state, and they used fire. So, in other words, they violated a lot of the principles of the Islamic jihad or just war teaching. Again, it has not been practiced. Sometimes it is practiced. In the Crusades, there was a very noble Islamic ruler who really tried to follow this very carefully in conflict with Christian soldiers, right? Not attacking first, only responding in proportion, right? No violence against crops or fields or buildings. So he ended up being very well liked. There were some Islamic rulers who understood this just war teaching, were able to actually follow it. Friends, we've got to wrap it up in 15 minutes. I want to point out a few things on page 9 and 10. And on page 9, I describe this spectacular Abbasid Empire. I think, again, we didn't learn much about this in the West. But let me summarize and say, without Islamic learning that got, exploded in the Abbasid Empire and was carried over into Spain too, without all that, we would not have this thing called the Renaissance or the scientific revolution, or maybe not even the Enlightenment. All these things that the West takes great pride in, which are good, I believe. A lot of it came from Islamic sources, but this has been hidden. Anyone willing to? I'm going to keep going with you, Donna. Can you read the second paragraph?
The cultural
cultural and legal foundation. Yes, please.
Cultural and legal foundations of the Abbasid Empire must be deemed outstanding from any fair perspective. Students of many nations thronged schools. Great works were produced on a wide range of subjects. Expansive libraries contained thousands of volumes. Wide regions were explored, foreign lands and distant ages investigated, written works translated, dictionaries and encyclopedias prepared, and Arabic numerals developed. Thinkers, scientists, and creative visionaries found meeting places in major cities, offering each other assistance. Architecture combining an ethereal grace with solidity spread from Mecca westward to Spain, eastward to China, and northward to Russia. Methods of agriculture improved, ships and caravans maintained vigorous trade. Do you want me to go?
Yeah, that's enough. Okay, you've heard of coffee, right?
Yeah.
Well, the institution of coffee is an Islamic invention. In Baghdad, they said, let's have a lot of coffee shops. And we're going to wake people up, and we're going to have art and poetry and science and politics discussed in those coffee shops. So in the early 1800s, Al-Mamun, one of my favorite caliphs, set up a whole bunch of coffee shops. And this was supposed to replace taverns. No more booze, no more alcohol. We're going to wake up. We're not going to wind down. We're going to lift up higher human nature. So think about coffee shops in a different way. I think you still see some of that. It's a good place for, say, poetry reading or something, or a mini drama and artwork you'll find in the coffee shops. And imagine that there's a tradition of all the people who are rulers and thinkers gather there, and all kinds of new ideas burst forth out of the coffee shops. That's a glimpse of Islamic civilization exploding. Al-Mamun started this thing called the House of Wisdom, which was like a think tank that developed into the Islamic University, which was repeated in Cairo, Salerno, and several places in Spain, Sevilla, Toledo, Cordova, etc. Lots of European intellectuals went to those Islamic universities in Spain, not too far away. And then about 100 years later, say the 1100s and 1200s and 1300s, European universities emerged, in France, in England, in Spain, north of where the Muslims were dominant. Okay, so I'll read another paragraph. This is in about 1/3 of the way down on page 9. Magnificent cities of Baghdad, Damascus, Gondeshapur, and Cairo became flowering centers of higher arts and sciences. They developed unique forms of Islamic architecture, calligraphy, literature, music, poetry, theology, ethics, jurisprudence, political theory, philosophy, and mysticism. They added significantly to the fields of logic, algebra, chemistry, astronomy, medicine, history, geography, sociology, economics, horticulture, and agronomy. This was light upon light, shining for all peoples who could behold a divinely civilized civilization. So I'm summarizing the top of the good news that came. Muhammad had said, seek knowledge from cradle to grave. This is a hadith. This is why I don't buy the idea that you can ignore the hadith. You cannot ignore the hadith. The Quran is more important, but the hadith is very important. Seek knowledge from cradle to grave. So there were caliphs like Al-Mamun who took that seriously. We're going to seek knowledge from cradle to grave. Another thing Muhammad says, seek knowledge even unto China. In other words, go to the ends of the earth and absorb knowledge. Bring it back here, translate it into Arabic, and build upon it. When you do that, you will start something we call a university or a research center or a think tank. And that became a model that was copied in Europe. Okay, I described the House of Wisdom 2/3 of the way down. And the classical texts in science, math, etc., from a lot of different places, collected, translated, systematized, codified, developed, and published and taught. A lot of work. Okay, so it bothers me when we describe the development of European history and ignore Islam. There's something missing from that picture, right? Where a lot of the knowledge came from. Istanbul was conquered, right, by, I don't mean Istanbul, Constantinople was conquered by Muslims and then renamed Istanbul. So that happened in 1453. A lot of the knowledge in old Constantinople went into Europe, right? It was like a brain drain of some of the Christian scholars went over to other parts of Europe, especially Rome. That's true. That happened. There was a brain drain from old Constantinople. That's not the only source, however, because a lot of what those Christian thinkers knew, they got from Islamic sources. For example, Copernicus was using the records of Al-Tusi, right? An astronomer, Islamic astronomer. Okay, and then I don't have to say much about Spain because the same thing happened in Spain as happened in the Abbasid Empire, right? 500 years of an explosion of knowledge, plus, here's what's unique about Spain, cooperation between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, an unprecedented degree of cooperation. You know, in 1492, though, all this comes to a crashing halt because Ferdinand and Isabella reconquer Spain, the Reconquista, and they kicked out who? Jews and Muslims. It was like kicking out the cream of the crop. That's just my opinion, right? That was not a good idea. Because for 500 years, they had been getting along and building an incredible civilization. If you go to Spain and look at some of the things built during those 500 years, your breath will be taken away. Okay, friends, that's it. I quit. Oh, I forgot. Page 10, two more. Suleiman the Magnificent and Akbar the Great. I described them. They were two figures who really developed a well-developed legal and justice system. Of the two, I like Akbar's better. It was what I call, in India, it was a meritocracy. He was looking for the best people, no matter what their religious and cultural background was. How amazing is that? So I'm just going to read a paragraph that, no, Donna, can you read where it said Akbar listened respectfully? 2/3 of the way down on page 10.
Yeah, sure. Akbar the Great, reigning in Mughal India.
Yeah, not that one, the paragraph below that.
Okay, Akbar listened respectfully to complaints at all levels, attempting no conversions to Islam, but was forceful against treachery. A well-developed network of reporters and civil servants informed him of needed improvements. He eliminated many corrupt practices in the government and military and greatly reduced tax burdens on peasants. His efficient and just system, operating as a meritocracy that attracted the most able and influential people, led to such prosperity that European rulers and merchants became intensely interested in establishing trade relations. Agra and Delhi became flourishing centers of culture and commerce.
So Akbar, yeah, that's enough. See, so I'm giving you an example. Akbar was to Islam, so was Al-Mamun, so was Abdurrahman III in Spain, as say Cyrus and Darius were to Persia and Zoroastrianism, and as Ashoka was to Buddhism, and as Constantine and Justinian were to Christianity. Next session, which is in 2 weeks from now, we're going to look at some of the great things that happen in the West, having to do with legal and justice concepts. So so we're going to say yes, there were very good things in the West too, just like there were good things all in other parts of the world. Right? We're going to go back home now and try to appreciate it as if for the first time. You and we were taught a lot about Greece and Rome, right? And Jews and Christianity. We were taught a lot about that, and Charlemagne and the Magna Carta and stuff like that. But we thought that was the highest stuff there was anywhere about justice and law. And that isn't the case, but that's what we were taught. Okay, friends, comments, questions, complaints, polite ones.
Comment.
Yeah, comment, Donna.
I think we could use an Akbar today.
We need one of these just rulers. Yeah. Ashoka too, or Darius or Cyrus, right? Yeah. Okay. Anything else, friends? Yeah, Bill.
Just sort of a procedural question. Your new book, Eye to the Ages, I got that recently. I guess that sort of expands on many of these topics.
Well, it's written by the same guy. You know, I tend to look at things in the macro way. Like if I'm studying history, what did all the people around the world say history was about? I tend to do that. Go to different. So that, yeah, there's some overlap between the same. I've used a similar method with looking at justice. What did people in different parts of the world say justice was? Where did it come from? What was the role of religion in that? When did they deviate from it? When did they express it the best? in the highest forms. So I use a similar methodology, whether I'm looking at history or religion or justice.
Mhm.
That's just the way my brain works, for better or worse. So there's overlap between my courses. Yeah, I'm going to give some talks on that book, Eye to the Ages. I've been told it's up to me to sell that book because no one else is going to do it. There's no agent working on it. It's a do-it-yourself course, you know. Yeah. So, for example, during World Interfaith Harmony Week, there's a talk on that book in Surrey, and there's going to be one in West Van, February 4th. And anyway, but there's also a slideshow on that book. Bill, since you said this, I'm going to send you the slideshow on that book.
Great.
28 slides summarizing that whole 450-page book.
Me
Harold,
too.
I'd like it too.
Me
Can you
too.
send it to this group?
I think I'll have to send it to Rachel, and Rachel will send it to all of you folks. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yes, there's
Thank you,
family
Harold.
resemblances. Yeah, bye-bye. Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Harold.
Are we finished? Or can I
I
just
think
give you
we're
a comment?
finished. Yeah, one more, Donna, please. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you because just on a very surface level, what I've learned today is helping balance where my ignorance was at the beginning of the session, specifically to do with things like jihad and Sharia, which I'm familiar with the terms, but my familiarity has to do with news coverage, and it's the media pointing to the troubles, and I had no idea that it's a much broader concept. And so this is part of my learning, but I just thank you so much. There's so much here that
I was just like you before I touched this stuff. I was afraid to step on an Arab bus in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right? I thought anything Arab is bad, dangerous. I knew nothing about it except what the radio and TV told me.
Yeah.
They
Or showed us.
tried to show us. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.